Alright guys, Beelum here, back with a new video. In this video I'm back with another player ranking for the latest season of Survivor US, where here I'll be ranking every player from Survivor 46. For like my other videos, I'll be ranking them based on how I feel like they played on this season. And obviously we have 18 players to rank here, and let's jump right into it. At number 18, we're starting it all off with a player that I really don't feel like had much potential on this season. I don't really feel like they had much going for them, to where while they did technically outlast a certain other person that will be higher than them on the list, I do feel like their long-term trajectory in the game was simply just never there, and that person is Jess. Jess is someone that I just think was not really suited for Survivor. I don't think there is, again, much potential there for Jess. I mean, she's someone that was instantly on the bottom of the original Yanu tribe, to where had they gone to tribal instantly on day one, I do think she would have been the very clear boot from that tribe. So obviously she does end up surviving the first round in a position where Q ends up really sinking Jelinski's reputation, ends up putting this massive bullseye on him. But despite that, again, I think there was at least a point where Jelinski was better positioned in the game, or at least he was in the initial majority alliance, while Jess was just kind of there, being an easy person to be picked off, one that no one really bonded with, where her closest connection to game was Q, yet despite that, Q was active participant in getting her out of the game. Now, I think you can argue that the fact that she stays during that first round is probably based around her relationship with Q, and that Q was willing to throw Jelinski under a bus because he was connected to Jess. But again, I don't feel like we really have solid evidence on that exactly being the reasoning, to where, again, taking that out of it, I really don't feel like there's that much really to praise Jess for, outside the fact that she just simply survived that first vote, where, again, I don't think there was any potential for Jess on this season. I don't think there's ever a point where she was ever going to survive more than 2 tribals on this season. And again, just felt like someone that was just not suited for the game, with her seeming to struggle in like pretty much every aspect of the game. So because of that, for me, I have Jess here at number 18. Now number 17, we're moving on to another player that is actually still not the first boot, but from the same tribe. At number 17, we do have Banu. And Banu is an interesting player in the sense that I think he's definitely in the conversation, one of the worst Survivor players ever. I think even in comparison to Jess, while I think Jess has absolutely no potential in the game, I think Jess at least had good reads at points. Again, she still recognized the fact that the fake idol that she played was fake. Like, she seemed to be like a pretty intelligent person, to where I think if she were not starved and sleep deprived on an island, I think she could potentially play a good game. But Banu is someone that I don't think there's any potential there at all in any aspect, to where I think Banu is someone that was obviously instantly on the outs of his tribe, or while he wasn't targeted right away due to physical strength and him not messing things up as much as Jelinski did, even then he was still someone that was a complete mess in the game. Now he was able to hold it back for the first few days, where it wasn't until the first tribal where he really starts to show that more wild card side of him, and him pretty much leaking the plan to take out Jelinski in front of him. But once that occurs, again, the rest of his game's just very sloppy. Again, he's really saved round 2, again, seemingly just due to the fact that Jess is more of a liability in challenges. Again, even in that position, Banu gets extremely paranoid and thinks that he's going home. He, again, was going to be the boot in the third round, to where he gets saved by a random medevac, and he completely wastes that opportunity as he's just taken out the following round with no real chance of saving himself. To where Banu is just someone that, again, I just don't think is good at the game. I think he's someone that has no real upsides here outside the fact that he survives 2 tribals, and both of which being more so due to outside circumstances than anything he does particularly well. To where, again, in comparison to Jess, I think Jess could be a better player in the grand scheme of things in any given season, as I think she has a better strategic mind for the game, even though she's not really able to utilize it considering the context. But Banu is someone that just simply doesn't understand the strategy of the game. Though while he is a massive fan of the show, I just don't think the concept of the actual social dynamics are something that he actually just fundamentally understands. Where, again, the fact that he was so aghast at the fact that you can lie to Jeff is just a clear indication of just how aloof he is to the strategic aspects of the game. And again, like, to me, he's just someone that has no real long-term prospects, to where if he does survive the round that he's booted in, I don't think there's any chance that Banu is ever winning this season. So maybe there's a chance he gets dragged all the way to the end as a GOAT, but again, he's someone that should have been the 3rd boot of the season, is actually the 4th boot of the season, and had no real prospects moving forward. So again, for me, that's enough to put Banu here, number 17. Now number 16, I'm moving on to player. I remember when the premiere aired, we got this talk about how he might be the worst player of all time, which again, I never really agreed with, but there were a lot of people saying that. I don't agree at all. At number 16, I do have Jelinski. Now again, Jelinski's not good. Obviously, he's still a first boot. He's still someone that had his entire tribe turn against him by the time of tribal, though again, I think there are bigger upsides for Jelinski than there are with Banu and Jess, both of which who were on the bottom from the very beginning, was never really able to survive that position, despite they survive over Jelinski here. But again, Jelinski's someone that, again, I will credit the fact that, again, he's at least in the majority alliance right away, and again, that alliance doesn't survive to a tribal, but again, he's able to cultivate these bonds with Q and with Kenzie early on, where again, it puts him in a majority alliance, even despite the fact that we have Q later turning on him. We do have Tiffany and Kenzie seeming to have his back initially, though obviously that doesn't fully go through. And really, in general, I do question how much to really blame him for him being booted in the first round the way he does. Where obviously it seems the way that things crumble is the fact that Q ends up turning against him, to where Q is annoyed at how Jelinski just quits at things when Q is also that way. Where again, in a way, it kind of feels like more of an ego thing of Q just pushing all the blame on the quit onto Jelinski, when in reality he also played a factor into that. But also, like, I feel like Jelinski's a player that I actually don't necessarily disagree with how he was approaching the game from a strategic point of view, to where, well, again, I do think the social ramifications of the things he was trying to do are definitely questionable. Again, I think he had decent enough reads in the game. Again, he gets a lot of flack for quitting the sweat challenge, when in reality, again, I think that probably is the move to do. Now, obviously, again, people are upset at him for doing so from his tribe, but I think the practical situation that they were in is that, again, they were never finishing that challenge, and it's a waste of energy to continue going for that. Along with the fact that, again, I also agree with his decision to quit, along with the fact that I also agree with his decision to fold during the journey challenge, to where that's also a position where he was in a losing position either way, to where, again, I actually agree with these calls that he makes, to where, again, that's something in comparison to Jess and Banu, who I feel like do pretty much nothing really right throughout their runs outside of just surviving over Jelinski, to where, again, Jelinski in his one round, I think isn't playing that suboptimally, even though I do think he does obviously mismanage his perception, again, building up this reputation of being this quitter in the game, which, again, is not good, but I think the flaws of Jess and Banu are much grander than that of Jelinski, to where, for me, again, I have him here number 16. Now, number 15, we're moving on to a player that I thought had a lot of potential in the game coming into the season. I thought this is a person that, even after the first few episodes, seemed to be very well positioned in the game, though that all crumbled very quickly. And at number 15, we do have Gem. And again, Gem is a player that obviously is the first boot of her tribe. She is the first boot from Siga, to where, again, she kind of had to be relatively low on the list due to that. But again, it's a position where early on, it did seem like she was actually well positioned. It did seem like she was in the majority alliance with the women all being together and them having Charlie's Angels with Charlie, and it had that power structure stayed true. It did seem like Gem was in a pretty decent spot, especially considering the fact that she obviously finds the idol for the tribe, to where, again, it felt like everything was on the up with Gem. Though, again, obviously, I think Gem ends up playing the game really sloppily, and the fact that she replants the Boer advantage is just really dumb. Just opens up the opportunity for her to be caught and become a target due to that. Even beyond that, it seemed like she didn't really gel with her tribe, to where her tribe was a very kumbaya tribe, with Gem clearly coming off as an outcast there, and her being this more game-centric player that just did not gel with that group. Where, again, I think she mismanages her relationship with Tim. She obviously came off as cagey due to her having to constantly lie about the Beware advantage, and again, it's taken out the first opportunity. Now, again, in comparison to the last few people we talked about, she's above them because, again, like, she still found an idol in the game. She had an ally when she was booted with Mariah. Again, there was a point where she did seem like she was in the majority alliance. Again, there are some upsides here, though. Again, I think the fact that she is taken out in the spot that she is completely on her and her sinking her own reputation in the game, to where, again, overall, still a very sloppy player, but one that has those minor upsides that leaves her here at number 15. Now, number 14, moving on to a player one step above her. At 14, we do have Mariah. And Mariah is, again, essentially the same thing, but survived one more round. Again, Mariah was in the same position as Gem. Now, again, I don't think does as much actively wrong as Gem, where obviously Gem, again, kind of sabotages her own game. I feel like Mariah, again, was a more stable presence. Again, she was in the same position of being alongside Gem and being left out of that first vote and having the Charlie's Angels alliance initially that flipped on her. But again, she survives over Gem. That's obviously a pro there. Now, I do think she plays the Murgatory round pretty much all wrong. I think her fully sticking by Siga in a position where she was very clearly on the bottom of them and not really even allowing the others to know that she was on the bottom, which made it so that she was less likely to be considered as a potential option for them moving forward, along with the fact that she kind of allowed the other Sigas to essentially throw her in a bus, to where she was just kind of this easy expendable person to get rid of. in the case that Asiga did need to go home, again, I think it's pretty poor play there. Now, again, at the end of the day, she still makes it to Mergatory. That's something. Still in a position where, again, I don't think Hersiga's wandered her out. Again, it was more so a position of the options were extremely limited, and she was just the most expendable of the bunch. But again, she's another player that seems like she has potential. But as for the game that she actually played on this season, again, there's not that much to praise outside the fact that, again, she was in that majority group early on, and she has a decent amount of longevity. But again, she was left out of the first vote. She is expendable number to pretty much everyone involved in the game, where, again, it's tough to really assess her too highly, which is why she's here at number 14. Now, number 13, moving forward to another person who is not in a good spot in the pre-merge phase of the game. This being a person that would have been a pre-merge boot had their tribe ever gone to the tribal, but never got that chance. And at number 13, we do have Soda. And Soda's an interesting player here. And again, in the same thing, she was in an initial majority alliance. She was alongside Tevin and Hunter, that seemed to have all the control on the original Nami tribe. However, by the time of the end of the pre-merge, she was the number one target on their tribe. If they had gone to tribal, I feel pretty confident in the fact that she would have gone home. Which, again, part of that seems to be due to the work that Randon put in and getting Tevin to think of Soda as a threat, though even beyond that, again, I think Soda mismanages some of her relationships in the game. Again, mismanages her relationship with Venus, supposedly never really gelled with Liz, and obviously didn't secure Tevin well enough to make him loyal to her, despite the fact that she burned her relationship with Venus to get closer to Tevin, to where, again, all that is really bad. And actually, really, I think there is an argument to be made that she is worse than Mariah, as, again, Mariah at least was never really in danger in the pre-merge, while Soda obviously was. Now, again, obviously the reasons to have Soda higher, the fact that, again, she survives over Mariah, in a position where she was also vulnerable during that vote. And even beyond that, again, I think she just naturally plays better post-merge, where, again, she was still a pretty expendable number. But again, she wasn't the person being constantly thrown under the bus at the merge. Again, that was more so Venus than it was Soda, along the fact that Soda, again, seemed to be reaching out to people like Charlie and trying to build a relationship with him, where Mo just kind of seemed to be a bit more isolated in the game. Where, again, I think Soda is someone that is at least playing the game a lot. So, again, I think Soda is someone that is at least playing the game pretty aggressively. And again, it gets her in trouble for sure. But again, I think the fact that she does outlast Mariah, along with the fact that she is playing more aggressively, seem to have more potential long term. For me, again, it's enough to put Soda here at number 13. Now number 12. And now we're jumping back quite a bit on the list here to the last remaining pre-juror on the list. And at number 12, we do have Randon. And Randon is a tough player to rank here, in the sense that obviously he was medevac third out of the game. Not really anything to really show for himself in the fact that he never went to tribal. Now, obviously, he had a beware advantage, and obviously would have had an idol had they ever gone to tribal, but really, we don't really get to see much of him in the game. We don't get to see much of what he was doing outside the fact that he obviously created this rivalry with Venus, only to then build a bond with Venus, which, again, leaves him in a weird spot on this list. Though, again, I decided to put him at 12 here. I think putting him at a spot above Soda just makes sense. Again, the fact that, again, we learned from Exopress that it was Randon that really put this target onto Soda and would have led to Soda being the first boot. Again, I think that's something to credit Randon for. Also, beyond that, again, he had the beware advantage. He utilized that to build this relationship with Venus seemingly being loyal to that. Again, that's something that's also impressive there. Like, really, I think Randon is someone that had potential in the game. I think Randon is someone that, again, I very much underestimated coming into the season. I thought he would be persona non grata on his tribe, the first boot from his tribe, with no one really liking him, but it seemed like he actually got along with a good chunk of his tribe. Again, cultivated this relationship with Tevin, to where he got Tevin to turn on Soda. Supposedly he had a good relationship with Hunter. He obviously was close with Venus. Again, he had a lot going for him, to where I do think there is some missed potential there with him not obviously getting to actually properly play the game, to where, again, I think it's tough to really rank him on this list. I can see even the argument for him being higher, considering, again, I think he actually had a lot of longevity on this season, but the reason he's not is because we obviously didn't really get to see any of that. But again, because of the potential he had and the fact that he obviously essentially causes the Soda boot, I felt like it was enough to put him here right above Soda here at number 12. At number 11, we're moving on to a player that I am largely conflicted with, in the sense that I don't think this person is that good of a player. However, they did make it pretty deep into the game, in a position where they were on the right side of the votes for a lot of the game. However, had absolutely no social capital, had absolutely no win equity, and no one really liked her, which makes it tough to rank her. But at number 11, I'm gonna go with Venus. And this was a big debate for me on where exactly Venus lands on this list, because at a point I did have her higher, simply just due to the fact that, again, she made it very deep into the season. And again, technically never votes incorrectly until the final 8 round, which is like pretty decent for someone that isn't in any of the true social dynamics in the game. But when looking at the players that are above her here, I just feel like all those players have more impressive games, or integral parts of the majority alliance at points, had much more agency in the game than someone like Venus, who never really got anything truly done. So while she thinks she did, obviously, she thinks she pulls over, she thinks she pulls off this soda move, when in reality that was Tevin the entire time, and she seems to think that she's involved in like taking out Hunter, when again I think that was really the doing of almost everyone else in the game, to where Venus is just a tough player here, because again, like, I think she's someone that on paper doesn't play an entirely bad game, but when you actually look at how the game played out, her game is pretty lackluster, where again, right away she's on the outs of her original tribe, doesn't bond with Tevin, to where probably would have been the first boot from her tribe had they gone to any of the earlier tribals. So again, I think she builds a good bond with Randon, and through that, Randon does put in a lot of good work to put the target onto Soda instead of her, which again is something you can at least credit her for, along with the fact that obviously she gets screwed over by the fact that Randon gets medevac from the game, her only real ally throughout the entire season. But again, she comes in and emerge, being this expendable number, instantly thrown under her bus by her own group, but also Q just instantly not liking her and throwing her under a bus as well, which really leaves her at the bottom from that point on. Again, being someone that isn't looked at as trustworthy, even though she is involved in all these plans that go on, she simply just is not that integral to really any of them. And yes, she votes out Mariah, but that's someone that she didn't want to go home, and that was purely a self-preservation move. Yeah, she's involved in voting out Soda, but again, that was a move that Tevin put together, and she was misguidedly tricked into thinking that it was her move. And yeah, she votes for Tevin, but again, that was a move that, again, she had very little to actually do with. She was simply just there for that move. And that's a move I would credit a lot more to Liz, where we really don't see Venus doing much to get that vote to go through. Again, the eventual Hunter vote is one that mostly felt like a group decision there, and to be fair, I do feel like there actually is some decent play from her, and the fact that she is shown to be pacifying Hunter at points during the tribal itself, and we see her ratting out the fact that Hunter has an idol, which again is something. But again, she's completely left out of the Tiffany vote in a situation where it's actually kind of insane that she is left out of that vote, considering the choice is essentially to pull either her or Liz in to that vote, in a position where Liz literally just had this massive breakdown and yelling at Q, yet they still look at Liz as a more reliable number there, which is pure insanity. And she's obviously taken out in her final round with an idol in her pocket, which also shows some lack of awareness, which I'm too fair. Future people will be talking on this list also wrote out with idols in their pockets, but again, they had more agency throughout the rest of their game than I feel like Venus had. To where even in this situation, it seems like she actively sabotaged her own position in the game, where it seemed like Charlie was on board taking out Q until she ends up having this awkward conversation with him in which she implies that she has an idol but doesn't even fully commit to him, in a position where again supposedly she was loyal to Charlie and doesn't even get him to see that, to where again, it's just a really bad game. I mean, like, again, like, I think she's just terrible socially, didn't bond with really anybody outside of Randon, and even then that started off very rocky. You have her having some good strategic reads at points, but also same a number of bad reads, particularly the fact that she thought she did more in the game than she actually did, and in general again had no win equity at the end, and didn't even really have a path to the end, where because there were so many goats in the end game, it feels like she was the goat that was simply the least trusted of them, where she was just the most expendable of the goats in that situation. So again, I don't think Venus has much to really praise for in this game, despite the fact that she makes it so deep in the game, which again is what makes it tough to rank her here. I did decide to go with number 11 here. Now number 10, now we're moving on to a player that is also very tough to assess, and the fact that this person was also taken out a decent chunk before Venus, but also a player that was more involved in the majority group, even though even that is a bit rocky at points. But at number 10, I'm going to go with Tim. And again, Tim's just a weird player here. Again, he's someone that I don't actually think is that bad of a player, but his edit really did not do him any favors. Despite him actually not being that poorly positioned, having some decent reads in the game, it felt like the edit always set him up for a fall. I feel like the edit never really gave him a chance to really show himself as a decent player, as it felt like the edit was constantly undermining him. And again, we get this content very early on about him talking about his closest relationship being with Maria, only for Maria to undercut him, saying that she isn't wanting to work with Tim, despite the fact she does later work with Tim. And also, supposedly, that was even a true thing, that he just wanted people to think he was close to Maria, when in reality, he was close to Ben and was kind of trying to hide that relationship. The edit doesn't really show that. And again, the fact that we spend so much of the pre-merge on Siga thinking that Ben and Tim are on the bottom, when in reality they obviously end up being on the top by the time of the actual vote, again, kind of skews your overall perception of Tim. You thinking that he's on the outs and that he has these bad reads in the game, when in reality it's kind of not the case. He seems to actually have some decent reads in the game. Getting him picking up on the fact that it was Jem that hid the Buer advantage, and again, putting the target onto her. Now again, I would credit Ben more so of pulling over Charlie. That really got them the numbers there, but still, again, I think Tim plays solidly in the pre-merge. Now, coming to the merge again, I think Siga just as a whole plays it all wrong at that original first vote, where coming in as this really solidified grouping that is unbreakable, again, it's just a terrible strategy when the other two groups can just straight up outnumber you. And again, I think he fights a bit too hard to try to keep Mariah in the game in a position where it does sink his position within the Journey 6. But again, he's still part of the Journey 6, which is this alliance that did seem to have a lot of control early on in the merge phase of the game, but also is clearly an expendable number for that group, to where while that group seemed to genuinely want to work with him, he never was trusting of that group. And while it's fine to be trying to straddle both sides, and while I don't think that's necessarily a negative for him, as I can fully understand why he wouldn't want to work with the Journey 6, I think the fact that he is so open with them that he's essentially not with them by, again, not even telling Maria about her involvement in this alliance, him constantly trying to campaign to get rid of Anami and keep a Siga, and obviously his eventual move during his boot round of trying to take out Hunter, and all just really bad perception, to where the fact that he is taken out over Ben, I think is definitely a big knock against him for me, as there's really not much of a reason for most people involved in his vote out to actually vote him out over Ben. But that being said, again, I think he gets kind of unlucky in how the split tribal plays off, to where he's essentially swapped into a minority where the Yanus have all the power and are closer to Hunter than they are to the Sigas, where it kind of puts him on the back foot to begin with. And again, with Ben being his closest ally, he obviously goes and tries to save him. And again, I do think there are some unlucky aspects about how that split tribal ends up working out for him. But still, again, I think there's a lot of very mixed play with Tim. Again, there's some good, there's some bad. I did very much struggle on where exactly to land him, but for now, I'm going to land him here at number 10. Now number 9, and now we're getting to some of the bigger power players of the season, where really this next 3 that we're going to be talking about are all these like mid-merge boots that had a decent amount of agency at points in the game, and the ranking here is a bit tough. But at number 9, I am going to go with Tevin. And Tevin's hard to rank here in the sense that, obviously, he completely dominated his original tribe. I mean, he is someone that is in this massive power position on the original Nami tribe. He is the center figure in really everything. Again, he has deep connections to really everybody on that tribe outside of Venus. Again, Venus was the consensus person to be taken out in that first round if they went to tribal. And he has these extremely deep connections, the likes of Hunter and Soda, that became this big majority group. Had this connection with Liz, where she was looking at him as her number 1. Also connection with Randon, to where, again, Randon utilized that to take advantage of it and try to flip the vote onto Soda, but again, still had a connection there with Randon as well, to where, again, he just seemed to be in an extremely dominant position on the original Nami tribe, and that kind of continues over into the merge, where coming to the merge, again, he's part of the Journey 6, and they have that control early on to take out Mariah. But then we get to the Soda vote off, which is an interesting one in the sense that obviously it's a very impressive move for him to pull off. Again, him utilizing all of his social connections, which by that point he also has this good connection with Maria, and is able to pull off the Soda blindside. But at the same time, it's obviously just a terrible move for him. It's him getting rid of one of his closest allies in the game so early on in the game. And it's just a completely unnecessary move to make when I think he had these bigger threats to his game, particularly someone like a Charlie or even a Venus, to where, again, the fact that he goes for Soda in that position, again, someone that burned her own social capital to be closer to him, is purely insane there. And obviously it's part of what leads to his eventual boot, where I think if Soda had stayed, it would have been much tougher to organize the numbers against him in the following round. Yeah. Also, because he makes the Soda move, he has this big move on his resume, to where that causes Liz to want to flip the votes on him and make a resume of her own, to where, again, while I think you can question if it was the right move for Liz, also, she still does make that move as a direct response to him making the Soda move, to where he ends up being completely aloof at the fact that he's going out by the time he does. Literally the entire tribe knows that he is going home, where the only vote on his side is Hunter, who even also knew he was going home. Again, it's not a good look in his boot round there, and again, it feeling like the ramifications of the moves he had made previously, to where I think there are some massive pros for Tevin. Again, I think there are some impressive aspects of his game, particularly his pre-merge, where he is really just running the show with no adversity, though, again, I think the fact that he executes on the Soda move when there were just so many better options for him, and also just increases the target on his back unnecessarily. Again, it's tough to really rank him too much higher. To where while I did debate him with the next person we'll be talking about, I did decide to go with that person higher than him, which leaves Tevin here at number 9. And at number 8, again, we have someone that, again, essentially worked alongside Tevin the entire game. And while I think Tevin's overall position was probably a bit stronger than this person we'll be talking about, I think this person kind of one-ups Tevin by the end. And that person is Hunter. And again, Hunter's also a tough player to assess here, where, again, Hunter is in this pretty strong position early on. Again, not as strong as Tevin, where Tevin is the person with all these one-on-one bonds. Hunter kind of wins the battle during the pre-merge for Tevin's loyalty, where I think that is probably one of the most impressive aspects of Hunter's run on this season is the fact that while he isn't the greatest socially on his own, and again, didn't have the greatest one-on-one connections, he built the strongest connection with the person who had the most one-on-one connections, which ends up putting him in a very strong position in the game, with him having a lot of influence over Tevin, and really reaping the benefits of Tevin's position in the game. Along with that, we obviously see him being involved in the Journey 6, coming into the merge, putting him in a power position there, to where, while I think he gets a very unfortunate split tribal that could have led to him being a very consensus boot, again, I think he does good work in building a relationship with Q that keeps him safe during that round. Also builds a relationship with Kenzie as well that supposedly benefited him in that position, where despite him being this very massive target during that round, he's somehow not even considered for the boot, and it's always going to be one of Tim or Ben, which is actually purely insanity there. Now, following round, again, we see the crumbling of the Journey 6, to where once that happens, again, I think that's probably the biggest downfall of Hunter's game, the fact that he didn't really seem to have the social capital to really do much once things didn't go right for him. Again, a lot of his game was banked around the concept of working alongside Tevin, though once Tevin lost that social capital, Hunter just kind of seemed like a dead man walking, and we do see Hunter doing some last minute scrambling to get the votes back on his side, though that's ineffective there, and he ends up being on the bottom coming into the following round. Though really, I do think his boot round is a bit wonky, and I think that's something that does put him above Tevin. Is again, obviously he survives over Tevin, in a position where, again, he wouldn't have even been targeted if he didn't have immunity round over Tevin, but I also feel like he comes a lot closer to staying during his boot round, where with Tevin, again, he was pretty much screwed no matter what. He was pretty much a dead man walking during a lot of his boot round, where Hunter was in this position where the vote was actually on Tiffany, and pretty solidly so for a lot of that round, really up until the point where Tiffany mentions using her idol that scares people off of voting for her, that causes Hunter to be the target there. So again, I think he does get kind of unlucky that occurs, though at the same time, I don't think he plays the end of his game particularly well. Now, at the end of the day, it's also a position where, again, he's scrambling at the last second of him finally picking up on the fact that votes seeming to flip pretty late into the cycle, and him having to do some really late scrambling, and again reveals his idol to the entire tribe, which again is pretty misguided there, especially when he doesn't end up using it. Even with that, I think there's some impressive play. Again, the fact that he's able to pull over Q and get Q to vote for Ben, I think is good play. Now again, he fails to turn other people onto Ben, but even with that, again, he's still able to increase the chances that he survives the following vote without using his idol. Now, I will say the fact that he doesn't use his idol is pretty insane. Obviously, you get what he's doing. He obviously wants to try to get his cake and eat it too, of surviving this round, also having his idol for the following round. But the fact that he actually risked in this position is pretty insane, though at the same time, I kind of also respect it to a degree. Or again, at least he was aware at the fact that he was in danger, where again, it's still dumb that he knows that he's at least getting 3 votes on him and he doesn't use the idol. But again, it was a calculated risk. He at least understood the position he was in the game and just made, again, a very risky play, where again, in comparison to the next person we'll be talking about, I actually did very much debate their placement on the list because that person was not as aware of their position in the game, where again, at least Hunter was aware of his position. So again, I think there are some ups and downs here of Hunter. I think for me, there is definitely an argument for him being a spot higher. I actually very much contemplated it for a lot of my process of making this video, where again, I think Hunter, despite again it being a very bad look the way that he goes out and him not playing this idol in a position where it should have been very clear for him to play his idol, I actually don't think the rest of his game is that bad, where again, I think he does good work in building his bond with Tevin. I think he does good work in keeping himself safe at the split tribal. I think he almost saves himself during his boot round. Again, I think there are good things there with Hunter, though. Obviously, there's still this lack of threat management. Obviously, there's still this inability of him being able to recover once he faces adversity that, again, it's not great. So again, there's definitely these downsides to his game, but for me, it's enough to put him here at number 8. Now number 7, and at number 7 we're going with a player that, again, I very much debated this person and Hunter. I think they are very, very close, which I don't think is the general perception, as I think this person is someone that people do look at somewhat highly, though, again, I definitely have question marks with this person's game, and that person is Tiffany. And the thing about Tiffany is I think her first half of her game is very, very strong. Obviously, she is in a very dominant position on the original Yanu tribe, really in the center of everything, essentially being the Tevin of that tribe, though too far, I think Tevin's probably a bit better connected, but still, Tiffany, very good spot, being in the center of the majority alliance of her, Q, and Kenzie, having closest connections with those two individuals, where I don't think either of them were ever going to turn on Tiffany, and if they ever gone to a tribal with just the 3 of them, she would have been the sole decision maker during that. Though again, I think in comparison to Tevin, I don't think she has the tight bonds with the other people outside of her group that Tevin did. Again, I don't think she had a great bond with Banu. Really seemed to have the least amount of connection to Banu of the core 3. Also didn't seem to have a good relationship with Jess, and had the least amount of connection with Jelinski of the core 3. So again, I think she's someone that, again, was in a very good position within her core group that does end up being the group that does end up surviving to the merge, though it's also, though again, doesn't really show much flexibility from her game in that instance. While also coming into the merge, I think she's in an okay spot. I mean, obviously she is part of the Journey 6, though, again, seems to be the least involved in the Journey 6, where we really don't see anything from her, of her actually working with that grouping, to where we pretty much always see the likes of Q and Hunter and Tevin and Tim and Maria's perspectives, but it's never really seen Tiffany's. And part of that's probably because she was never really loyal to that group. But again, we do see her, again, still being in the majority and voting on Mariah. We see her alongside Ianu 3 controlling the Tim vote, though I will say, not a great look, the fact that during the Tim vote, she does want Ben out and actively campaigns for Ben to go, yet doesn't get her way there. And really from that point forward, she's one of the biggest targets on the board. I mean, she's really targeted for the rest of her run and barely squeaking on by. Again, she is the initial target during the Tevin boot round, where her own alliance flips against her after she throws Maria under the bus, loses the loyalty of Q, all that pretty poor play there. Though at the same time, I think you can argue that she had cultivated this strong bond with Charlie that probably did end up saving her there, or at least helped her odds in that position. But once again, she is a massive target during the final 9 round, in a position where her own closest ally in Kenzie flips the game on her and leads the charge in getting her out, had the votes to get her out, for them to just backtrack on that plan. Once Tiffany mentions that she's going to play her idol, which she obviously doesn't end up playing her idol, and I would give her a lot of credit for this, actually, if it had been this intentional play to try to get implicit immunity, but I don't think it was. I think it was legitimately her thinking she was going to play her idol in that instance and not even knowing that she was in danger, which again is kind of my issue with Tiffany's endgame in this position, is the fact that I think she is very unaware of her position in the game, where unlike Hunter, who again at least knew he was on the bottom and played accordingly, I feel like Tiffany thought she was running the game, when in reality she never was. She was always in a difficult position and thought she had more numbers than what she really did. Again, I think she burns her relationship with Q for no real reason at this point, to where, well, yes, Q threw you under a bus and obviously made your game a lot harder. He's still someone that is willing to work with you moving forward, and for you to just throw away that number is just kind of asinine, especially because, like, what are her other options? Again, she loses the loyalty of her own ally in Kenzie. She never really had the long-term loyalty of Charlie and Maria. I guess she had a bond with Ben, but again, same thing there. Again, like, who is she really going to go to the end with at this point? To where, again, we see her being blindsided at the final 8 with the idol in her pocket, in a position where really the entire tribe was willing to get rid of her. Obviously, it ends up being a 5-3 vote, but again, Kenzie was one of those votes not in on the plan, in a position where, again, Kenzie had actively campaigned against her the previous round. Venus is someone that I think would have easily voted out Tiffany had she been given the plan, though again they just wanted to leave her out for the sake of it. Where again, like, Tiffany had no real options long-term in the game. And I think that's what makes it tough between her and Hunter for me, where I do think Tiffany's pre-merge is stronger than Hunter's. Again, they're both in dominant positions, but I think Tiffany was more involved in her actual core, along with the fact that, again, she is actually being tested in those positions. She's actually going to tribals, while Hunter never had to go to tribal. Now, early post-merge, I think it's close. Again, they're both in these majority groups, though I would actually give the edge to Hunter, where, again, I think he has good play in surviving the split tribal, and even beyond that just seem to be more involved in Journey 6's machinations, but really their end games are rocky. Again, I think Hunter's at least aware of his position, but also gets taken out before Tiffany, in a position where Tiffany's own play saves herself, even though, again, I don't know how intentional it really is of her mentioning the fact that she's going to play her idol. But again, she's someone that was going to be booted during the round that Hunter was booted. She was also someone that was almost booted the round before that as well. So where, again, I think it's very close. I think for me, the big tiebreaker here is the fact that I just think she had so much more control on the original Yanu. that Hunter had on the original Nami, and obviously just makes it further to where I think they're very close. It's very interchangeable to me, though I think it's those minor pros there that leaves Tiffany here at number 7. Now number 6, and at number 6 we're moving on to a player who is just completely all over the board. A player that has some pretty decent highs, but definitely has some very low lows. A player difficult to assess from a player perspective, but at number 6 we're going with Q. And Q is a player here that, again, there were many points in this game where Q did actually have a decent amount of agency. There's points in this game where Q was dictating where the vote was going. However, at the same time, there's points where Q had no clue what was going on in the game and was kind of just being dragged through the game. There's points where Q obviously threatened to quit and that burned a lot of his social capital. So again, Q ends up being a player here that is very difficult to assess. Now again, I do think he starts off the game decently well. Again, on the original Yanu tribe, he's in a very decent position at the very beginning. He is part of the initial majority alliance with Tiffany, Kenzie, and Jelinski. He has this final 2 deal with Tiffany. He seems to be somewhat close to Jelinski, even though he proceeds to throw him under a bus. And really, that's the big issue with Q's game in the early portions of the game, in my opinion. Again, I think Q is someone that seemed to be decent socially early on. He had pretty good bonds with a lot of that tribe. Really, I feel like outside of Kenzie, he seemed to have very strong personal bonds with the rest of the tribe, essentially being in this position that should have been this like Tevin-like position, then just simply doesn't take advantage of that. Instead, playing into Tiffany's favor, allowing Tiffany to become the center of the main alliance, which, to be fair, obviously this is a situation where this is pre-merge, and the likes of Banu and Jess, who again he seemed to have the closest relationship to of anyone on the tribe, and they're obviously liabilities. So I do understand his decision to take them out over taking out the likes of Kenzie or Tiffany, but I do still think it's definitely a questionable move from a positioning standpoint. And obviously the big questionable move for me is him even targeting Jelinski to begin with. It felt like a completely unnecessary move, one that, weakens the tribe in terms of physical strength, making it more likely to go to tribal constantly, but also feels like a move that, again, is made to kind of weaken the positioning of someone like Kenzie in the game, even though he doesn't fully commit to that. Again, he proceeds to then just take out Jess and Banu, who are more of his numbers following this, and again, empowering Tiffany. So again, I do feel like he probably goes if they go to tribal once again in episode 5. I do also feel like he never really had the clear shot at Kenzie early on in the game, to where even though he still claims that he had her dead to rights in episode 3, I don't feel like that was what was going to happen, especially by the time we get to tribal. So again, I do think his maneuvering through that portion of the game is pretty questionable to me. And again, when we come into the merge, again, he once again has a highlight here. Again, he creates this Journey 6 alliance, which again was a very fractured alliance from the very beginning, but still puts him in a power position coming into the merge, already having this preset alliance that has a lot of clout at that point in the game. Also does pretty good work in working alongside Nami, again, having a really strong bond with Tevin and Hunter that also allows him to target Siga unfettered. And again, he does lead the vote there. Again, he is the main person leading the charge against Mariah in a position where he's doing so for kind of questionable reasons, but still, again, he does get his way there. And split tribal following that, he once again initially gets his way. Again, he wanted to flip the vote on Tim and did seem to be getting his way until he changed his mind midway through, which again is kind of the issue with Q, the fact that he is so flip-floppy in what he wants to do, and even though he does flip to wanting Ben out by the time to vote, and it flips back on to Tim, whatever, still, a lot of agency during that portion of the game. And even the following round, again, we have this blindside being set up on Tiffany, and he puts a lot of work into making that vote go through, even though, again, at that point, it is a terrible move for him. But again, he has a lot of agency up to that point in the game. But again, that's where his game completely fractures. Again, obviously, targeting Tiffany to begin with, really dumb move, targeting his number 1 ally in the game. While obviously, I do think he would have needed to get rid of Tiffany at some point down the road, I do think taking her out at this point was just way too early. And while I can understand his rationale in the sense that when looking at his positioning within the actual Journey 6, if that alliance were to make it to the end, he's essentially the swing vote. But again, that was never happening. Again, this is an alliance that was so fractured, with almost everyone in this alliance not actually being loyal to the alliance, with Tiffany, Charlie, and Hunter all voicing different directions that they want to go in. And that obviously all leads up to him threatening to quit the game, which again just burns all of his social capital, making people not want to work with him moving forward in a situation where clearly already pissed off people. I think it was very clear people were already annoyed at how domineering of a personality he was. Again, we already see Ben being annoyed at him even before all this happened. So again, I think it's pretty clear that he was already not particularly well liked by a lot of this cast, but this obviously completely sinks his credibility, makes him the biggest target moving forward for really the next few rounds, where obviously at that point he becomes this perfect smoke screen that people are able to utilize to pull off their own blind sides, where obviously we have the Hunter vote, where again, he has really nothing to do with anything that happens during that round. Mind you, again, it's a round that happens literally a day after his threatening to quit, to where I think it makes sense why he wasn't able to rebuild his social capital in that time, but still, he's completely out of loop at what's going on there. Votes for Ben, a situation where, again, that could have sent him home had the votes been split in a different way, as obviously Hunter ends up voting for Q in that instance, to where, again, all that really bad, we follow that up with, again, he's part of the Tiffany blindside, which, I mean, at that point, he kind of had to go for Tiffany, but again, the fact that he was able to rebuild this connection with Tiffany, I think, is still negative on him, especially considering the fact he even took her on reward. He was still not able to build any of that social capital back, but again, that becomes a point where, again, he builds a strong bond with Maria, and again, I think that is something to credit him for. Again, while, again, I do think it is also a pro for Maria that she was able to cultivate this relationship with Q and utilize him as a number through the end game, I still think there is some credit to be given to Q for him to be picked up by Maria as well. Well, again, I don't know how much actual agency Q is having at this point in the game, where I still think he's kind of being dragged on by Maria. I still think there is definitely some credit to be given to him, especially as this is a relationship that really holds following this. So where, again, it's not like he's just picked up for the Tiffany vote and then dropped immediately afterwards. He's obviously still really close to Maria for the next couple rounds, really until his boot, where obviously we see the Venus blindside occur, where again, he's once again a decoy vote there. Yeah, he's able to survive. Mind you, I think that one's definitely a much more precarious vote, where I feel like the Tiffany vote was one where that was pretty much always going to happen. Throw Q was, again, the smoke screen. I don't feel like the votes were ever going to fully stay on Q that entire round. However, I do feel like the Venus vote is one where I do legitimately think that Q was a goner until Venus's mistake flipped Charlie on her, to where, well, again, I think he does good work in maintaining his relationship with Maria. It also does create a bigger bullseye on his back at this point, as someone that he could take a shot at without having to take the direct shot at Maria. And then we get to the final 6 round, where obviously he's the boot there. I will say, I do think he gets very unlucky in how he's the boot here. Obviously, one in the fact that Maria ends up winning immunity, who was the number 1 target, to where more than likely, if she doesn't win immunity, Maria goes home during that round. The other factor, though, for Q is the fact that obviously he has his idol. And obviously this is something that a lot of people will talk about as this big negative for Q, that, oh, how dumb he was for not playing his idol. I don't even fully agree with that. I do think when looking at the game board for Q, again, he had already been used as a smokescreen for the last few votes, had already seen himself survive those votes anyway, to where, again, I do not think it's far-fetched of him to think that, oh, this is just what's happening again, especially when Maria is still telling him that that's the case. And beyond that, I understand why he risks not playing his idol in this situation. It's a situation where if he doesn't play his idol here, he's almost near guaranteed final 3. In a spot where, again, he could win, theoretically, but again, if he makes it to 5, he has an idol for 5. He talks himself about how confident he is as a fire maker, to where, again, he either wins immunity or wins fire at 4, meaning that he's, again, guaranteed final 3. So despite the fact that I do think there are definitely very goat-ish qualities from Q, I do also think Q could probably fight back against those arguments, to where I could definitely see a world where the jury turns around on him. I don't think it's that far-fetched to think that Q could possibly win a jury vote in certain situations. So again, I understand why he doesn't use his idol there. Obviously, he should have. Obviously, it's a misread in him not realizing what was going on. But again, I still think it's an understandable move there, to where, again, overall, again, like Q's game, just a lot of ups and downs. Again, there's definitely some highs in terms of his initial positioning with Yanu, his positioning at the time of the merge, and how much control he has early on. And also the fact that despite the fact that he just completely sunk all of his social capital, he was still able to rebuild it to a degree. And again, get in this spot where he was so close to making it to the very end. However, he still did sink all that social capital. He still essentially sabotaged the Yanu tribe to continuously lose. Also did come off very abrasive and wasn't particularly well liked by a lot of his fellow castmates. So again, there's definitely a lot of negatives there. But I do think, again, in comparison to the people we talked about so far, again, he's outlasted all of them. I mean, straight up, the top 6 on this list is the top 6 of the season. I just think, considering the fact that he did have control at some major portions of the game and had a lot of longevity, for me, that is enough to put him here at number 6. Now, number 5, and again, the top 5 here end up being essentially the top 5 of the season, which I do think might be a bit of a surprise to some people, in the sense that I think people don't look super favorably on a couple of people in the top 5. Yeah, I actually feel like this is a season where all the top 5 actually played pretty competent games. Where while all of them are flawed in their different ways, and while again the next two we'll be talking about are people that I don't think were ever that likely to win a jury vote, I do feel like the way they navigate through the game is still impressive to a degree. And at number 5, we're starting all this off with someone that, again, I don't think this person could win the game, and they definitely have delusions about their game, but actually probably has higher highs than the next person we'll be talking about. But at number 5, we're starting that off with Liz. And Liz is a player here that I do think is kind of being slept on, of a person that, and while she is this very wacky personality, very much comes off as that, and someone that didn't really seem to have much respect from the jury due to that, I do feel like she's someone that is kind of aware of that to a degree. Again, obviously she does get a very inflated ego by the end and thought she was going to win, but again, there was a point where she was aware of her perception in the game and was actively striving to change that. And I do feel like Liz navigates through games somewhat impressively towards the end game. So I do wonder, again, if it wasn't for Liz being this really out-of-the-box character, would she be perceived in the way that she is? Or in terms of navigation through the game, is her game really that different from a certain winner of the season? Now, obviously, pre-merge is kind of the point where, obviously, they're very different. I mean, Liz doesn't go to tribal at all until Mergatory. However, again, I do think she was safe within her group. While she isn't someone that was at the top of her power structure, again, the main power structure did seem to be Heaven, Soda, and Hunter initially, and again, she was safe from that. Again, she was relatively safe early on, where if they went to tribal, it did seem like Venus was in the initial target, and then eventually target shifted on to Soda, or something that she wanted, so at least that's something. But again, she was safe throughout the beginning portion of the game, and she's pretty quiet at Mergatory, though again, survives there unfazed. But then we get to the Soda move, where again, she tries to take credit for it because she said it was her idea because she wanted Soda out, but again, didn't really put in a lot of the work to do that. But again, realized, oh, Tevin's getting the credibility for this, and does pull over one on Tevin the following round, again, creating this big blindside on Tevin, which I do think is a very impressive move. Again, it's a move that I don't necessarily agree with from a pure positioning standpoint. However, for Liz, someone that again at that point was aware of the fact that, oh, her jury prospects are slipping, again, is making this big move to gain jury respect and still remaining not a threat following this, which again obviously comes down to overall perception and how the jury would have perceived her, which again is not favorably. But again, she does execute the Tevin move. I think that's something that again I would give her pretty much sole credit for, and we see her doing a lot of the legwork for that move. And despite her not being in the core group following that, again, she still navigates through the game pretty well. Again, despite being left out on the Hunter vote, she's able to become this swing vote for the Tiffany blindside and gets on board with that. She then is part of the underdog grouping that forms in the final 7 round, where while she does eventually end up voting out Venus, she's still involved in that plan. She still tried to organize votes against Q, and again, it ends up going through in the final 6 round, where again, I do give her credit, alongside Kenzie, for snowing Maria and Q through that round. And obviously, you have her at the final 5, working with Kenzie on the immunity challenge to guarantee Maria goes home. And again, I think these are all good things for Liz. Again, obviously, the big issue is the fact that, again, she has no win equity, which is what makes her overall assessment a bit tough. And the fact that also, despite her having no win equity, she still isn't someone that Ben wanted to take to the end. But again, I do like that she is an active player. She's a player that played very intentionally. Again, the entire plot of trying to act like she was a millionaire in order to try to get dragged through the game and then have this big reveal at the end. While that is a terrible strategy, I don't think it ever would have worked. And it shows intentionality in her game. It shows that she maneuvered through the game in a strategic way to where, again, I do have a lot of respect for how Liz plays the game, even though, again, it was a non-winning game. But again, mixing all that, the fact that she still has this big move in taking out Tevin, for me, I do find her game impressive enough to land her here at number 5. Now, number 4, moving on to another player that I don't think was very likely to win the game, but had pretty impressive navigation through the game at points, and that player is Ben. And Ben is a player here that, again, was in the majority for pretty much his entire run. I mean, the only point where Ben is not in the loop of what is going on is the Tim blindside, which, to be fair, I think is a very lucky situation for him, where it did seem like coming into that round, he was a pretty big target, and kind of gets the target off of him due to really nothing that he did, and more so Tim just losing trust within the core group. And even then, Tiffany wanted Ben out during that round, though again, you can also credit him for building a bond with Kenzie that had Kenzie fighting for him, though again, I don't really know how much of that really made a major impact there. But again, outside that, again, he was in the majority the entire time. Again, despite the fact that on the original Sega, it did seem like he was on the bottom alongside Tim, the reality is, again, he does pull over Charlie and Maria. Again, he did build this very strong bond with Charlie that kept them together the entire game. So while, again, he was someone that was being targeted as someone that could be a threat down the road, he is able to escape that blindside gem, which again, I do think I would give him some credit for there. Though following that, again, like, he is part of the Mariah vote. vote, though obviously didn't want that to happen. So again, that is also kind of a minor knock there. But really from the final 10 on, he is involved in every other plan. Again, he is one of the people that Liz goes to try to spread the Tevin vote. He is obviously involved in the split vote plan to blindside Hunter. He is an integral number in getting Tiffany out, being one of the main numbers that they needed to make that vote go through. He is also then the person that gets his way on the Venus vote, where that's a situation where Charlie wanted to flip the vote on Q, yet it seemed like Ben wanted Venus out. And again, Ben gets his way by the end, though again, not really due to much that he actively does, but still beyond that, again, gets Q out at 6. Gets Maria out at 5, wins final immunity in a spot where, again, he's probably pretty safe in that spot where it did seem like he was a pretty competent fire maker, and likely wins fire against Kenzie. The only way I think he goes home is if he's in fire against Charlie, which wasn't that likely, considering Kenzie's perceptions of Liz. So again, I think he had a very smooth ride to the final 3, though again, he had no winning prospects. People didn't seem to respect him, which again is strange considering there was a lot of talk about how good of a social player he is earlier in the season, but again, that all really comes to nothing. I don't think he can win the game. Again, I think that's what makes Ben's assessment a bit weird here, but again, in comparison to Liz, I think his game's a lot more stable. Obviously, Liz made a bigger move in the Tevin move, where Ben doesn't really have an individual move to that scale, and I do think straight up, I think Ben was playing a very emotional game. Again, that's the way that the jury talks about him, but not really in the sense that he is purely voting off of how he's feeling on any given day. But again, he's playing a very loyalty-based game. Again, he is voting alongside Charlie, actually even makes the decision at final 4 to take Charlie to the end, seemingly because he actually genuinely wanted Charlie to win the game. And again, that is something to knock him for in a sense. Again, I don't think he has the killer instinct to win the game. I don't think he really is this player that is ever going to make this move to win the game, but that's also part of what allowed him to navigate through the game in the way that he does. The fact that he was this very loyal number allowed him to navigate through the game unscathed. Where again, along the way, he's also able to really build this bond with Kenzie as well. That I think kept him safe as well. Where again, I think Ben does very good on building these one-on-one bonds, but again, I don't think there really is this cutthroat nature in him to ever win a jury vote. Where again, I think it would have to be a situation where he's against 2 really unlikable presences at the end, which again was not that likely on this season, though theoretically it's possible if he's at the end against, I guess, like Liz and Venus, but even then, who really knows? But again, I do think it is close between Ben and Liz. I do think Liz, again, probably had more agency in her game, was more aware throughout a lot more of her game, but I think Ben was just more solidly positioned throughout more of his game. I think his game's just a lot more stable, and also he actually makes it to the final 3, and much more smooth path to the final 3, which again is enough for me to land him here at number 4. Now number 3, and I will say number 3 here is a bit tough. I think number 2 and 3 on this list are very close between the two. However, at number 3, I am going to go with Maria. And Maria is an interesting player here in the sense that I think she was probably the biggest jury threat on this season. Again, the show portrays her as that. The show portrays her as someone that if she had gotten to the end, she would have easily won. And I don't feel like there's any post-game press up to this point that's really detracted from that. And mixing that and the fact that she was in a very solid position for most of the game, playing the middle very well, was really in a dominant position up until the Tiffany vote, which has her having a pretty impressive game up to that point. Again, there's a lot to praise in that sense. However, I think her game just completely crumbles at the end. And her game from the final 7 on is just a bit of a mess, with her just becoming a massive target on the board. Again, there's really lacking in threat management, which that's what makes her a bit tougher to rank here. But again, I think as a whole, she does play a very impressive game. Again, from the very beginning of the game, she is instantly in the middle. Again, she is attached to the all-women's alliance with Jem and Mariah. She has Tim thinking that they have this connection over being parents, despite the fact that she didn't seem to have any loyalty for Tim. She also obviously builds this middle alliance with Charlie that ends up obviously running the table. Again, she's extremely well positioned early on, only for her to make a questionable move by the time of their first tribal. Again, she does end up siding with the men and voting out Jem. A move that, again, like at the end of the day, I think Charlie was very resolute in siding with them, and through that Maria didn't have much of a choice. Yeah, I do think it's something that is probably not in Maria's best interest. Again, I do think, I think Ben is definitely the more ideal target for Maria at that point in the game, someone that Charlie has a more one-on-one bond with, and someone that is a long-term threat for her down the road, of someone that Charlie could potentially pick over her, which he does. To where, again, I think she doesn't get her ideal situation there, though, to be fair, I think it's tougher to actually get that unless she were able to trick Charlie into getting rid of Ben, which I don't think was ever really happening. But again, by the time of Emergatory, she is part of this Journey 6 alliance, again, being added in from her connection with Tim, though, again, to be fair, supposedly Tim was always closer to Ben, and again, this was just a smoke screen, but still, she is included in this alliance, through which, again, we see her build a really strong bond with Q, which obviously lasts most of the game. She already had a really strong bond with Tevin from the Journey, to where, again, it did seem like Maria was in this position position to where had this alliance actually stuck true, she was in a pretty solid spot within that alliance. Though obviously the alliance crumbles, but even despite the alliance crumbling, she's still in a pretty decent spot. So despite her own SIGA members going home and Mariah and Tim, by the time of the Tevin vote, she is essentially right in the middle and ends up being in the middle for the next few rounds. Now, realistically, I think the Tevin move probably still goes through without Maria on board. However, the fact that Maria and Charlie do jump ship and integrate themselves within the other side, I think is pretty impressive there. Though, again, at the end of the day, still not an ideal target for Maria. Again, getting rid of Tevin's not great for her. Again, Tevin is something she has a pretty good relationship with. Obviously, targeting Hunter would have been a better target for her, though he had immunity. And obviously, just the entire fracturing of the Journey 6 is not ideal for her to where, again, it's not a move that is optimal for her, but I think she adapts to it pretty well in that instance. And again, I think her play over the next few rounds is pretty solid. You're really playing the middle of the game pretty well, picking up Q as an ally, initially seeming to use Kenzie as a shield for the Tiffany vote, though obviously that Tiffany vote doesn't go through, and they obviously take out Hunter, which again, still give her some credit for, though obviously I'd probably give other people more credit for the Hunter vote, but again, I would give her a lot of credit for the Tiffany vote, where it does seem like that is purely on her. Again, her building this bond with Q to add a number on their side, along with the fact that we see her bring in Liz, to where again, the Tiffany vote is essentially the peak of her game, though again, she does it in a way that just increases this massive target on her back. It's a move that, again, she ends up taking all the credit for, to where while that would have been very impressive, she made it to the end, where again, I think that's a game-winning move for her. It also makes the path to the end near impossible for her unless she were to win out, which, to be fair, she does come very close to doing so. She obviously wins Final 7, Final 6 immunity. She gets to the Final 5 in a spot where had she won that challenge, she then would have had 2 opportunities to get through the Final 4 round. Again, if she gets to the end, she probably wins. However, again, her endgame is really a mess. While she's still in control for the Venus vote, she's getting her way there. It's really a spot where like she has very little actual control over that vote. Again, really the likes of Charlie and Ben are the real deciders during that vote. So again, they had already made the decision to turn against Maria. It was more so a timing thing at that point. However, again, like at the Final 6, completely duped there. So while she is, again, having the killer instinct to make the move against Charlie, thinking that Charlie is the big threat in that position, willing to turn against her number 1 ally, it's still a spot where she is just completely outplayed by Charlie. Charlie already organized all the votes against her, and she's completely outplayed by really everyone there but Q. And again, there was obviously the way of surviving that. If Q had played his idol, she would have been in a very strong spot coming into the Final 5. Even though, too, for Q has talked about how he was willing to turn against Maria at 5. But still, I do think she definitely would have had a lot more outs in that position. I do think she was relatively close to winning the game, where while she was, again, in this position where she essentially needed to win out at the end, I think she comes kind of close to winning out. We're again, had Kenzie and Liz not work together in that Final 5 challenge. Again, who knows if Maria wins that challenge. So, again, I think her placement on this list is largely because of, again, her win equity, along the fact that, again, she played a very impressive middle portion of her game. However, again, I think she makes some not ideal strategic decisions at points, and I think she just really mismanages her threat level, which is enough for her to land here number 3. Now number 2, and obviously the top 2 here end up being the top 2 of the season, though again, if you heard me talk about this in my review, at number 2, I do have Kenzie. And again, Kenzie's game here is a very tough one for me to assess, where obviously Kenzie ends up winning the season against the person that is number 1 on this list, which makes it a bit tough to actually rank it this way, especially when, again, I think there are impressive aspects to Kenzie's game. Again, I think Kenzie played a very flexible game, a very adaptable game, one where she faced so much adversity throughout her season and was able to overcome most of that. However, I do wonder how much of that was actually due to the things that she actively did in the game. Now, again, I think there are definitely some strong moments for her, where again, she is very well positioned on the original Yanu tribe, to where despite the fact that there are people that are willing to go after her from the likes of Banu and Jess, it never really felt like that was an actual practicality. So while we have talk from Q about how, she's going home in episode 3, it never really felt like that was actually going to happen. A lot of that because of her really close bond to Tiffany. Though despite that, again, I think she makes a bad move in taking out Jelinski. I think that was definitely not a good move for her, especially considering she had a closer bond to Jelinski than many of the other players on the tribe. I think she survives over Jess and Banu for being a more stable presence in the game. And I do think she largely gets saved due to her connection with Tiffany, which again is definitely a credit to her social game that she was able to build this really strong bond with Tiffany. But still, I do think when people talk about her as if she was playing this really great game in the pre-merge, I don't really see it that way. I think she's largely kind of clinging on to the game barely. And again, a lot of that due to the fact that she's on a very bad starting tribe. But still, I don't think her positioning is as good as it could have been at that point. And coming into the merge, again, she is in a decent spot, largely because, again, the Anus are not looked at as a target. There's obviously bigger people to go for. But despite that, again, she's being left out of the Journey 6. Again, that's an alliance with literally her 2 other Yanu counterparts, though she's not included. Though, to be fair, fair, again, I think Tiffany was always more loyal to Kenzie than that alliance. But with that, again, it kind of leads to the point of, like, Kenzie was never really in an alliance throughout this entire season, where, again, we see her be in this alliance at the very tail end of the game. But really, again, outside that, I never really felt like she had this, like, real group around her. It felt like she was always just kind of clinging on to the game. But again, she votes out Mariah. Doesn't really have that much agency, seemingly, during that round. The Tim round's obviously an interesting one, where she does get her way. So again, I do question how much she actually played a factor into that, and we do see Tiffany and Q just wavering all about, and I think it's a bit unclear about how much agency she really had in getting Ben to stay in that position. But again, with that, I should mention, again, her social game is really flourishing during this portion of the game. Again, she builds this bond with Ben that keeps her relatively safe in the game. She supposedly builds these bonds with the likes of Venus and Liz and Charlie and Hunter that really help her navigate through the end game. So following that, again, we see her being part of the Tevin blindside, though again, not a major orchestrator of it, and it seems like Liz just approaches her about the plan and she goes along with it. But again, it's something that definitely benefits her in the game. To really completely break up this Journey 6 alliance at that point, Jin is involved in the Hunter vote. Though I will say that is one that I don't think is actually in her best interest. I think she's making a move that isn't in her best interest, which again is part of her wanting to blend in with the crowd. But I think Hunter was definitely a number for her, and Hunter seemed to be actually loyal to her. Talks about in his Exit Press that she was his number one at that point. Like, I think her deciding to not tell him to play his idol is just a pretty misguided move at that point, along with the fact that I think her completely ostracizing Q at that point is also a misguided move. Obviously, again, in this world, Q would have been the person idled out in that position, but again, she just completely burns her relationship with Q, despite Q wanting to get the Yanus back together, which I thought was pretty misguided as well. She also tries to blindside Tiffany during that round, which is also a pretty bad move, and again, really gets saved by the fact that Tiffany flaunts her idol, which stops that entire plan. And again, it's funny that she creates this plan to blindside Tiffany, only then be left out with the following vote when the actual vote actually happens. Which, to be fair, I mean, allows for her to avoid credit for taking out Tiffany, which I do think helps her positioning in the game, but still just a really bad look for her to not even be involved in this plan that she initially created and be left out of the vote there, kind of being on the bottom to where, again, she's talked about as a split vote against Venus. Again, we see Ben voting for Kenzie kind of accidentally, but again, it was because of this notion that there was going to be a split vote on her, along the fact that she doesn't get her way during that round. Again, it's a round where she wants to work with Venus. She created a final three with Venus and Liz that seemed like her ideal position to be in, yet she just relents and lets Venus go home. But again, I think she recovers at the final 6 round. I think she plays that round pretty well, where at that point her and Liz are the swing votes, and I do think she does good work in tricking Maria and Q into not realizing what's going on, allowing them to blindside Q with an idol in his pocket. And then again, we see her and Liz work together at the immunity challenge to take out Maria, which is also a pretty good move. Again, really emphasizing the relationship she built with Liz. But then we get to the final 4, where again, I think it's not a particularly good look at that point. The fact that she built this really strong bond with Ben, only for that bond to not matter and him to throw her into fire anyway, and they're her barely beating Liz, and then her to really struggle in the fire making against Liz, but again, it's somehow gaining her to jury vote Maria because she saw the look in Kenzie's eyes or whatever. Again, I still think the overall jury vote is still very perplexing, and the fact that so many people just shifted their votes at Final Tribal was just very strange. Again, the votes that Kenzie gets and the votes that she doesn't get just don't really make sense based on the season we saw. To where again, we see her having these really strong bonds with Hunter and with Liz, yet they don't vote for her. But how much it's talked about that she wins because of her social game. Now again, she maintains the votes of like Tiffany and Venus, who she had strong bonds with, but then she also gets like the vote of Tevin, who she didn't seem to have that much of a relationship with, though to be fair, again, I think it was a world where Tevin kind of looked at it as like, this is the game that I wanted to play, and that's why he voted for Kenzie, along with the fact that, again, she gets Q and Maria's votes, though again, those just seem very wonky. Again, Q essentially voted for her because she was honest about how she was going to use the money for herself, while Maria votes for her because of, again, the very wonky situation at the Final 4, along with the fact that, again, also says because of her answer here, which, again, just weird to see people, like, needing the money to matter in modern Survivor. But again, through Final Tribal, she loses the votes of Hunter and Liz and Soda. All claim that they were voting for her coming into Final Tribal, which again is not a particularly good look there. And she barely wins in a 5-3 vote, where had it tied, Ben would vote for Charlie. So again, I think the fact that she like barely squeaks out the win on this season is just, again, very rocky. Where in comparison to the number one person, I think that person had a much more stable game. I think that person had a lot more agency in the game and still almost won the game. Whereas Kenzie really that much better than that person in terms of jury prospects. To where I think considering how inconsistent Kenzie's game ends up being and how she, again, never really led a vote throughout the entire season and fails to get her way numerous times in the season in comparison to the number one person. Again, it's enough for me to land Kenzie here at number 2. And now number 1, the number 1 player of Survivor 46 ends up being Charlie. And it's not really that close. I think Charlie's number 1 by quite a bit here. So again, I said this in the review that I think Charlie plays probably one of the best runner-up games in history of the show. I think it's a very impressive game of him being pretty much in the middle and being a major driving force in the strategy for pretty much the entire season. Again, we see him right away being in the middle. For when Siga is divided between men and women, we see him being the guy that is brought into the women's alliance and ends up bonding with Maria. That really puts him in the center of the game. Along with the fact that he also builds a really strong bond with Ben and ends up getting his way at the first vote. Again, he's the decision maker in the gem vote and is able to get Maria to go along with him, which again, I think is all very good play there. And I think coming into Merge, he's not actually in that good of a spot. Again, he's in a position where he's not in the Journey 6 alliance and he's also vulnerable at that first vote, to where we do see Venus talking about potentially taking out Charlie, though obviously again it doesn't go through there. We do see Charlie making the optimal move there and putting a split vote onto Venus, which I think is the right call, even though obviously the eventual Mariah vote is something that he didn't want to happen. But then we get to split tribal, which is a situation where again he should have been screwed. Again, he got a pretty terrible draw for him, a position where he should have been the dead man walking, and he was put in a group of 4 Namis and 2 Sigas, a spot where the other Siga member Maria won immunity, him also again not being involved in the Journey 6, him just being a dead man walking, then somehow doesn't get a single vote against him. Ends up being another swing vote in that position, though to be fair, I do think Maria is probably more of the actual swing, as we do see him talking with Venus about blindsiding Tevin, though I think a major reason why that plan doesn't go through is because of Maria's relationship with Tevin, which again, I do think that makes it so, again, Maria probably is more of the actual decision maker in that vote, but again, he's still involved in taking out Soda. We then see him again be part of the plan to take out Tevin. Again, I'm not going to give him that much credit for it, but again, he was still involved in it. He was still, again, playing the middle very well in that position. Again, was eventually added to the Journey 6, ratted out Q to Tiffany, which ends up completely burning Tiffany and Q's relationship. Like, all really strong play there. And again, he ends up being part of the Hunter vote off and was going to be part of the Tiffany blindside had that actually occurred. Though, again, I think the final 8 is probably the point where I would start to give him a lot more credit for his game. I think really up to that point, I think he's kind of a second command to Maria. While again, he does get his way at points, I think Maria up to that point was better positioned in the game and better poised to win the game. Yeah, I think it's at the final 8 where I would start to give Charlie a lot more credit. Again, Charlie supposedly had this really strong bond with Tiffany and was able to convince Tiffany to not play her idol at the round that she was blindsided through the prospect of blindsiding Maria, which again, I think that's all very good play. Now again, it might have harmed him in terms of jury perception of Maria, but again, I would still give him a lot of credit for the Tiffany blindside, especially in how he handles it, where despite him, again, being able to be the one to convince Tiffany to not play her idol, he's also not taking any of the blame for that vote. Again, Maria is getting all of the credit for that vote, but also all the target for that vote. To where, again, while this might be an issue for Charlie in terms of jury perception, where I think he gets to the end, where people just don't really know what he did and look at him as someone that was in Maria's shadow, I think this is the point where he starts to build an argument for himself, is able to really just put this target on Maria's back, to where, again, at the final 7, we do see him really take control of the game, where it's at that point that we see him pretty much flip on Maria, to where while he isn't taking out Maria in that spot, which I think is the correct call, we do see him really playing the middle alongside Ben at this point and builds his working relationship with Kenzie and Liz, and was going to with Venus, though again, obviously ends up taking her out, which again, I still say is kind of a questionable call for me. Again, I do feel like Venus is someone that probably would have been loyal to Charlie, with her being someone that was just kind of looking just for anybody that would actually work with her. OL Q is someone that is less likely to work with him long term and actually directly targets him the following round. Also, I think Q is also a pretty decent shield for him the following round, so it's not that egregious of a move. But again, we do see him lead the charge against Maria at the final 6, only for her to win immunity, obviously, and him to take out Q instead, but it really just sets the ball in motion for taking out Maria at the final 5. Now, I will say, I do think there is some poor play from him, the fact that he is pretty unaware of the fact that Maria is coming for him, but again, he already set up the dominoes really well up to that point and making sure that Maria and Q were targets ahead of him, which again, he's able to get them out back to back there, which I think is impressive. Getting him into a pretty fortunate final 4 situation, where again, I do think if Kenzie goes out 4, he more than likely wins. And I do think if he had 1 immunity, I think that probably is what he strives for. considering we do hear him talk about how he would have taken Liz, and more than likely Ben would beat Kenzie in Fire, to where he probably wins if he wins final immunity. Though, obviously, Ben wins instead, and while he's able to convince Ben to take him to final 3, again, obviously, Kenzie's a much bigger threat to him at the end than Liz. And I do wonder if there was more that he could do during that round of him trying to get Ben to throw him and Kenzie in Fire, or even just throw him in Fire against Liz to get a guaranteed win. I do question if that's maybe something he should have done to try to gain respect from the jury, where by him not doing that, I think it really plays into just being confused of what he did in the game, where a lot of his game was behind the scenes, and I thought he played like a very safe game, even though, again, I thought he played a very impressive game. Again, we get the final tribal where, again, he's able to pick up jury votes. Now, he also loses jury votes technically from the likes of Q and Venus, but I still think he performs pretty well at final tribal, and obviously picks up 3 votes, where again, he was supposedly only getting Q and Venus coming to final tribal, and comes out of it with 3 votes, getting Soda, Liz, and Hunter, who all switched their vote at final tribal. To where, again, I think that's impressive there, and he comes 1 vote away from winning the game. Had they gotten to a tie, he wins the game. Ben votes for him. To where, again, it's a very impressive game. Again, it's a game where I think there was a lot of agency in his game. I think he plays the middle very well throughout most of the game. Yeah, I think he gets his way on the original Sega tribe. He is able to really take the reins of the game at the final 8. So again, I think there is some issue here in terms of jury perception. I don't think he's able to really ever convince the jury that he's really the person that's running the game. So even though he does have this like last second surge in him being able to convince people at final tribal about how strategic he was in the game, it's not enough to end up winning him the game by the very end. Even though, again, he comes extremely close to doing so. But again, I just feel like, again, in comparison to Kenzie, I think Charlie, again, was in a very strong position from beginning to end. Again, had very few danger spots in the game. Again, really had no real spot in the game where he was out of the loop and didn't know what was going on, when Kenzie did have that. Now, technically, they were both pretty safe throughout most of the game. Really, neither Kenzie or Charlie end up being in that much danger throughout a lot of the game. Though, again, I think Charlie's path to the very end was a bit stronger. Again, I think Charlie seemed to be the better fire maker of the two, where I think he could have gotten through the final 4 round through fire. He also, again, had the loyalty of Ben by the end game, which, again, could have been a game-winning relationship for him, to where I think even pre-merge, I would say Charlie was better positioned in the game than Kenzie, even though, again, Kenzie obviously came from the weaker tribe, which obviously plays a factor into that. But again, I just think in the direct comparison between Charlie and Kenzie, I think really the only thing that I would actually give as a pro to Kenzie is the fact that she obviously wins against him in a jury vote. But again, even that is barely beating him by just 1 singular vote, in a position where she even loses jury votes at final tribal, to where I feel like, again, when looking at Charlie's game and how consistent it was and how much agency he had in it, especially in comparison to Kenzie with him being a no the entire time, again, for me, it is enough here to put him at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Survivor 46. Wrapping up my coverage on Survivor 46. Now, moving forward again, before Survivor 47, later this year, I will be redoing both my Survivor season and winner rankings, which again will probably be made within the next few weeks. Will be out way earlier on my $5 membership tier than they are in the actual channel. So again, if you want to watch them early, you can watch it there. But beyond that, obviously I have just more of the typical Survivor videos coming up. We obviously have Big Brother coming up, which I'll be covering as well. And obviously I'll be back for Survivor 47 later this year to do this same style of content again. So stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.